Hi, welcome to God Stories today. My name's Chris Thompson. You guys coming? Hello and welcome to God Stories today. I'm in a place that makes me feel a little bit nervous. It's Church House in Westminster. It's pretty much the engine house of an awful lot of what the Church of England does. And I don't know about you, but growing up on the streets of South London, I always feel like a bit of a naughty boy. When I come to a place like this, I always feel like someone's going to say, "What are you doing here? Out you go." So I'm just waiting for someone to say, "You're in the wrong place, Chris. Come on, out you go." Because as I said, we're in Westminster and it's an amazing place. And if I can a little bit later on, just so I can context it for you, out of this window here is Westminster Abbey and the Houses of Parliament here. And it's absolutely stunning location. And this window overlooks directly over Dean's Yard, is that right?
That's the one.
Brilliant. I'm here with Ian McIntosh, the Head of Formation for the Church of England. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's really, really great to have your company, it really is, and I can't wait to hear your God story. Before we go on though, as per usual, may I invite you all to look at us at social media. We have a Twitter account, Instagram and Facebook. Just look for God Stories Today. And please may I encourage you to subscribe to the channel as well. Because when I invite people to subscribe, what I'm really saying is, can you support? Because this is an evangelistic ministry to show people just how much God is alive and real and wants to know them personally and be in their lives personally. So by subscribing, you are supporting. So if you can do that and spread the word, that would be great. Ian, I'm really thrilled that I've got your company, I really do. You've got a really responsible job in the Church of England. We normally start with a snapshot of where the person is in their life right now. Yep. And it seems really pertinent to do that with you, because you're Head of Formation. What's that?
Well, essentially, it's the lovely task of overseeing a team of people whose responsibility it is to shape in God's grace and form women and men who are preparing for frontline ministry. It's one of those lovely places where I get to see from a particular vantage point a huge vista of what God is doing, mainly through the lives of dedicated colleagues, training in institutions around the country, what they're doing to help people grow to the people into the people God wants them to be. I was previously involved hands-on in one of those places, helping to shape people in the east of England for public ministry. I've now got a job where I've got responsibilities to make sure that sector flourishes and the individuals within it can come into their greatest potential.
It's a small job then.
It's if you think too hard about it, you wouldn't get up in the morning. Got some
coffee in the back there if you like.
Absolutely. You wouldn't get up in the morning and travel in. But I've kind of learned that actually I'm part of a team. I've got a ridiculously stupid title, Head of Formation. Is that about line dancing? Is it about aerobatics?
I never thought of that.
No, it's just about giving some voice to a really important process that fundamentally is about what God is doing. Because I mean, I'm not doing the forming. The Holy Spirit, the mission of God is doing the forming. I'm to help be a vessel for others. So I work not only with an immediate team of people, but I work with 23 really talented institutions doing that forming work with a whole lot of bishops and in a sense as part of the whole church, because formation is a lifelong journey. Loads and loads of people have been part of shaping an individual's formation. I'm just a cog, a small cog in their life's journey.
Bless you, mate. I probably should have prepped you for this question because it came to mind as you were talking.
Right.
It's not often that someone gets to speak to someone with the kind of like broad view that someone like you has. And I don't normally prep people with questions at all, actually, so I just wanted to let you know that. But I just kind of feel that we should ask Ian, because you've got that vision. What is God doing in the Church of England now then, with reference to formation and ministry? And what can you see God doing in terms of like forming people for new ministries, developing existing ones, that sort of thing? You don't have to answer that if you want.
No, it's fine. No. Well, I'm very excited by what is happening. Depending on who you are and what statistics you read, you can get quite demoralised by the way in which the Church of England is both placed and received. But I think that, for instance, we haven't quite seen the growth in ordinand numbers that the National Church would like to see. But there are 20% more people in training than there were 3 years ago. That increase is the product of a lot of hard work and people responding to the call of God. So what I see is a mixture of a whole range of people from right across the church giving of themselves in response to God's call. I see an increase in younger people and especially also in women candidates coming forward. We're just beginning to see a small change in the number of people from BAME heritage communities coming forward. This is a whole lot of life-giving signs that God is at work. And yes, you're right. I think one of the things that's also happening is that people are coming into this call wanting to respond to being pioneering, both within the institutional inherited church, to renew and transform that in more outward and missionary engagement, but also in the whole line of people who are saying, yes, I want to work outside the boundaries of the church to form new Christian communities. And what's really exciting is that that kind of language and that kind of call, recognition of where God is, seems to me to be now part of a whole lot of different church traditions. It's not just the prerogative of one, it's becoming much more the flavour of all. Now, obviously, if you're listening to this and watching this from a small rural community of 30 people in a church that's cold and you haven't had a loo installed for 500 years, you might think, what planet is this man on? And I get that, but I think across the national church, there are signs of hope.
I agree.
Deeply.
I totally agree. Even for my lower stance, I totally agree, and I want to emphasise. So thank you for that. I really do appreciate it. So this is your God story.
Yep, thank you.
Where were you born?
I was born in Barnet in North London.
You're a Londoner?
I am. Right on the edge. I mean, some people might say...
on the edge.
Some people might say North London, it sort of borders the green belt. It's, yeah.
Wonderful. And from your notes, because you very kindly sent me some notes, you said that you had like a Christian upbringing, and it was deeply rooted in church from the get-go.
Absolutely.
So tell us about that, and what were the big sort of like God moments in your early childhood then? You know, did God burst in at any point? Did he sort of, I don't know, knock on the door to your life in any way, challenge you, steer you, form you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Form you.
Well, I guess there are quite a number of us for whom that kind of cradle Christianity has been just deeply rooted. I mean, what I think my parents and my sister and I have inherited a lively personal faith. That was so for some families, going to church was a routine, but for us, I think it's always been invested, certainly for my parents, with real personal faith, meaning. So they basically, Ruth, my sister and I, went through Sunday schools, churches, additional kind of young people's events as we were growing up, Crusaders, as it was called then, Urban Saints, which it is now, all sorts of places where faith could be really nurtured. However, I suspect I'm not unusual that during my teenage years that kind of becomes a bit more formulaic, dries up a bit. But, I mean, I can distinctly remember having what I would describe as a faith deepening moment. Others might describe it as a conversion experience. I don't think that when you are so kind of steeped in the life of a church it's necessarily that. But there were two things happened for me. Interestingly enough, we came as a youth group to a venue very close to this building, Central Hall, Westminster, where there was a kind of, I think it was a kind of mission event run by the Hildenburg community. It was called New Heart for the Nation. I'm now remembering this deeply. And that was those lovely passages from Ezekiel, I will put a new heart take away a heart of stone, make it a heart of flesh. And hearing those stories of faith in a fairly big event at Central Hall, Westminster, music, speech, talk, I think that was the space going every Saturday over a period of weeks that really began to say to me, Ian, this isn't just a head faith, this is something that changes the heart.
So move from there.
Absolutely, and I suspect that that's not untypical. So it was a real movement of the heart where I suddenly thought, actually, this is about life, how you live it, how you respond, how you pray, how you feel God's presence. And I think over a period of those weeks, that became really important to me. It came alongside, actually, shortly after, my dad and I used to take holidays going to walk in Scotland.
Oh, right.
And actually, in the quiet, because my dad's a quiet man, in the quiet accompaniment of walking, chatting along Scottish footpaths, in the Isle of Skye in particular, I think I had space to, as it were, do that processing head to heart. So the event here in London and the space in Scotland really, I think a new heart, whatever you want to make of that encapsulated, and I was kind of 15, 16 at the time, that was really, really crucial for my faith development. I mean, much went on before that, but that's a really big moment.
Do you think that really big moment, that process as well, those two things combined, were collectively also big moments with reference to your ministry as it is now? Because it sounds to me like the head to heart experience of attending the event not too far from here, but also the space that walking in Scotland with your father, also with, like, I guess, a spiritual elder.
Absolutely.
The space of that enabled you to go deep, be contemplative, and to form. And shape, I guess, something of what you understand to be important.
Absolutely. I mean, I may not have known it at the time, but I think absolutely, partly for me, it's really interesting. Your faith journey is sometimes, isn't it, deeply linked to places. So our whole conversation could actually be a narration of different places. But actually, that experience on the Isle of Skye and down here in London, yes, began to shape me. But I think it's also fair to say that, like a lot of young people, I probably led a slightly bifurcated life. I went to a school where it was harder to be living out that faith and that life. I enjoyed football, I enjoyed punk rock. Some of these things are beautifully part of faith and life. For others, it might not quite all resonate and live together. So
seriously, I'm just going to pause you. The football bit is great. But the punk rock bit?
Yeah, I know. So
that's so cool.
That's so cool. Or it's one of those places where you kind of live. I mean, it's not terribly easy to reconcile Ian Dury and the Blockheads and the Sex Pistols and Sham 69 with Christian faith, and I completely get that. So, but that's been part of my process. As it were, it's also part of who I am, because as it were, all that actually, it probably represents something about me as a person, also saying God and faith link into every part of life.
Absolutely.
That streak of music has some really difficult parts to it, and I don't want to associate part of it which overplays violence, sexism, racism, or whatever. But there's something very powerful and slightly anarchic about that. And I suspect what it also does, Chris, is reveals that even within somebody who's sitting within a place of enormous privilege in this building, there's still a part of Ian McIntosh which wants to say,
you heard it here first. I've got this image now because I grew up on the streets of South London listening to soul rap and R&B, and I love that music, that genre of music. I literally just can't sit still when that kind of music comes on the radio.
Indeed.
I've got this image of you now driving home tonight and sticking that on.
I know, but hey, I mean, it's kind of, that was part of a fusion of worlds. But I think, I mean, as I matured into an older teenager and adult, I mean, not that that's lost, but I mean, that's...
No, I get it.
I think, like a lot of people, you recognise that your discipleship with Christ needs to be lived out. You work that out as you go along. I suspect it probably was more at university where leaving home, you then inhabit a space that you've got to make decisions and presenting yourself. Yeah, I mean, I chose to present myself as an active Christian in that place. So, I mean, that's the way faith matures. And I think my call, to answer your question, which, sorry, I've deviated from, I think the call to ministerial, call to respond to God in terms of one's life vocation was more rooted in that place. But you're absolutely right, the stuff earlier on is deeply formative.
Totally.
Deeply formative.
Ian, that is just superb, it really, really is. Actually, before we go on, I better just let you guys know, we're in this wonderful office, as I said, near, in Church House, Westminster, but the aircon is something which I can't turn off. So if you're hearing a slight sort of like air sound, or it might be coming as like a humming sound or on the microphone, that's what it is. I'm ever so sorry. Hopefully it's not too distracting for you. But you mentioned a call to ministry.
Yeah.
Okay, in your punk rock times. It says here in your notes, call to ministry rooted in your, obviously, childhood experience of your parents imparting their faith to you, going to church, and the head to heart movement and all the rest of it, as you said, and this wonderful image of you, such a beautiful image of you walking with your father.
Yeah.
Amazing. What a dad, basically. But it says here, though, that you felt a call to ministry, in particular, at Cromer Beach Mission as a young adult. Briefly tell us about that. Was it?
Fantastic experience to go at 18, just having taken my A-levels, so just about to have a bit of a year off, thrown into a completely new experience, basically Children's Holiday Club on the beach for a fortnight in North Norfolk. I just wrote to Scripture Union, who were running it, and said, I want to do this, no idea where you want me, send me somewhere, so they did. So I was completely fresh in. Began the first of 4 or 5 years there, where again, going back each summer, so to the same event was a team of volunteer adults, Christians from all over the country come to give 2 weeks of their summer to basically a whole lot of activities. It's a lot of stuff on the beach. Things change since then. Some other kind of group activities where children come to a site to engage with all sorts of faith, fun and games and the like. But actually, as a young adult, you're thrown into both team membership and then quickly into team leadership. Wow. And here I pay tribute to a man called Andrew Thomas, who's also happens to be a Church of England vicar, who was the team leader at the time, recognised capacities that I had, so I became a co-leader of the 8 to 11s group. But things like being asked to lead the small act of daily worship or on the beach, and more importantly being a speaker at those events, 5 minutes of faith. And I can remember now being asked to do the first Sunday, first event on Dare to be Different from Daniel, so we're speaking about boldness and courage in faith. So I can remember that 30 years ago now and more. So that sense of somebody in a very different way from my dad, who was quietly working in the background, and also sent me, interestingly, very quietly one summer to work with the homeless in London, but in the same kind of way, an interesting reflection that someone like Andrew Thomas, playing a different sort of, you call it mentoring these days, when you're mentoring a coaching leadership role, says, I recognise those skills, I'm going to give you the environment in which you can practice them.
When you were there, what did you see God do? What was the most profound moment of, if you like, God activity with the people you were ministering to? And also, was there a moment when, or was it a gradual season when the sense of calling to ministry came upon you? Or was there like a lightning bolt moment where you said, actually, this could be a thing?
I think the most profound and humbling moments are when young children, again, 8s to 11s, make real steps in their own faith journey. So I could, in the work that was most profound was what we used to do in age-related activity every morning, prior to then having the kind of beach event as a late morning conclusion. And I can remember reading the Bible with young children, doing the kind of Bible notes to equivalent, working through that. And I remember one in particular making a very distinct move, into committed faith.
Oh, really?
Lovely, over that couple of weeks period. So those things live with you. I think as far as the wider call is concerned, Chroma and its work was a contributory factor. By far and away the biggest influence was experience I had at university working in Christian Union
let's go there
leadership.
then.
So
let's go there then.
That was the Chroma stuff began before I went to university. But then I went to university. I had 3 years there and was involved in local and then national, in the whole university Christian Union leadership. And it was through that experience, leading a team, effectively, I was the president of the Christian Union there. Really the kind of the leading, the kind of ways in which you're shaping that particular ministry, which is a different sort of ministry from a church, all that leadership stuff, that was really deeply formative. And it was through a couple of people, again, significant, isn't it? Individuals play a role in your life. Jane Keeler, who was on the staff of Holy Trinity Church in Cambridge, recognising gifts that I had. And then beautifully, a man called Sean Atkins, who also is ordained, came to lead a small residential event for our college Christian Union. Walking back down the street from that event, I can remember it now. It's at Regent Street in Cambridge.
Okay.
I can even remember.
Should be a plaque.
Can visualise the place. He said, Ian, you have the skills that the Church of England needs. Have you considered ordination?
Okay, pause there then. I want to get into your soul, if I may.
Good,
okay.
please do.
How did it feel, at that moment, and how did it feel to thus have a calling, have that sense bubbling up inside your soul? What was it like to be Ian at that time, with God going knock, 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 knock?
Well, Chris, it's really interesting because it was almost an external knock.
Really?
In the sense of, it took somebody else to say to me, I think you've got the skills. Perhaps that's Ian in self-deprecating mode, not... I don't think that lessened the inner call, but it's... and working today as I do with people who are also responding to God's call, it's not unusual for that call to start by the voice of somebody else.
Yeah.
It's kind of almost like the Samuel and Eli thing. Who's calling me?
Gotcha. Yeah.
You need somebody else to help you to find what's so inside. And I think that's my story. Others I know have a much deeper and immediate kind of revelation of what is. But from that moment, it changed my perspective, and I began to think, I need to listen to this voice. Somebody whose wisdom I respect is shining a light into my life and saying, you, Ian, have the beginnings of...
And how did it feel?
It felt, it actually felt, I think, really exciting. Daunting, but exciting. Exciting because I think if you've been brought up as my own background did, to live a bit in your head, you kind of tend to overthink things. That pushes it down into the guts and says, okay, that's not just hearing, I need to feel this inside. So it was a mixture of excitement and daunting, a mixture of excitement saying, actually, perhaps this is now what I need to be shaping my life towards. The degree that I studied was geography. It wasn't going to lead on to an immediate next step job. So that beginning of hearing God's call through that voice was also about saying, well, how do I shape what comes next in order to realise this call? But I kind of think, faith and passion and faith and ability to kind of be grasped by it has always lived with me. But I think in later years that's grown more so. I was probably less confident. So if you'd had that conversation with me walking down Regent Street, you might not have seen a great kind of visage change.
Just a punk rock kid.
No, not even that, actually. Not necessarily even that. Probably rather staid and... Anyway.
So what would you say? Because around here it said like you went to your BAP, your bishops.
Yeah.
A BAP is a Bishop's Advisory Panel in the Church of England. It's a 2 or 3 day event these days anyway, where, may have changed that, where a person who's been on a discernment process basically kind of goes along for like the final sort of like discernment before a recommendation for training or not is given. Is that a fair description?
That's right, absolutely.
What would you say before you say describe what your back was like? Because mine was terrible. I got through, but I hated it because some people love it. My wife loved it. I couldn't stand it. I was so nervous. What would you say to anyone watching this interview now as head of formation and who's just described the significant people in your life who called out your vocation, your vocation? What would you say to anyone who's watching this right now who maybe sensing a stirring in their heart that actually God might be doing something along the lines of calling them to ministry, be it lay or ordained?
Indeed.
But I think specifically I want to say is like, but they just sit there like I did when I felt a calling. No, it can't be me. Can't be me. No, it's for other people. What would you say to them?
Well, the stories that we hear and we tell each other basically say it can be you. That's the answer. That's the fabulous thing, isn't it? If you look in the scriptures, there's so many times, aren't there, where people are saying, no, too young, can't speak, not the right shape, size. And God is continually saying, yes, you can. The lovely story to Mary, the announcement by the angel Gabriel, you can do this, absolutely. You will be the one. I just think that in times that we are living in where our self-worth often takes a battering, doesn't it? Our belief in ourselves, proper belief, God-given belief in ourselves, that we're created in God's image, we're loved and blessed. Beautiful image from Isaiah about, I will walk with you, do not fear, I'm going to accompany you. Wherever the storms are, the waters that may overwhelm you, I will be there. Very formative for me as a young adult Christian, that stuff. I'd say, yeah, absolutely. Quite properly, churches need others to help us see ourselves in the round, have our calling discerned. But I think that, go with your heart. It may be, of course, that God is calling you to be a Christian in the 7-day-a-week, work-a-day world. And frankly, we've underplayed that as a church too many times. And that for me is the primary calling, to be a disciple. If, however, you're having done all that and you're feeling still a nudge that there's something else, then there are lovely processes there to explore that.
So, in 1987, you went to Trinity Bristol.
I did.
Which Sean Docherty's looking after now.
He is.
What a guy. He's super cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was for your ordination training. You say here that placements were massively formative.
Yeah.
But you also met your wife.
I did.
Nicola.
Who is the greatest formative influence on my life. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, blessings on Nicola, but let's go to the placements first.
Yeah, okay.
What did God do? I really want to hear what God did in these placements to other people, to you. How did he show himself in these placements? And what were the placements?
Yeah, there were two in particular.
Okay.
The first was at a women's remand centre
right.
in Puckle Church outside Bristol. So I was unusual. Most people did placements initially in a church. I was sent on a Monday afternoon into this remand centre. There was a male prison chaplain, and I went with a female ordinand colleague, but the two of us were the only men in a room of 10 or so women who met for Bible study and conversation every Monday afternoon. It was extraordinary.
Really?
It was, for me, life-changing in the sense of opening my eyes and heart to the experience of people who are deeply broken and vulnerable, how to be a man in a room of women, how to come across in a way that's undefended and unthreatening, and just to see the stories of God's repair
what
and
were
repairing. Well, these are stories of women right at the edge of drug addiction, of abusive relationships, finding a safe space in which they can explore the healing love of God, and led by a chaplain who facilitated the group without needing to overly, this is, I suppose, what you might call faith shared carefully and quietly, without a big, necessarily a huge kind of faith story. I can't honestly remember anything immediately kind of life transforming, but it was that sense that here was a space in which the healing and restoring love of God, actually what's coming to my mind as I'm speaking to you, all those lovely shepherding images in Luke, the finding of the lost, the searching of the lost coin by the woman, the image of the wedding, the feast of the lost son returning home. That's a kind of finding a space that's home for people broken. But it's one of those amazing experiences where I felt I learnt more than I gave. I was invited to make contributions, but it was one of those things of just what faith, in order to communicate faith, inhabiting the world that your hearers and conversation partners are in is vital, and that was one of those words. And I mean, for somebody brought up in wealthy suburban, comfortable London, university, that was a real experience of another world, and hopefully a world not entered into with the patronising paternal I've got something to do or to give. It opened my world horizons to what you might learn and receive about what God is doing, which is kind of been the story of how I think mission and encounter with God happens, that God's around in the world and we're there to discover where God is, to bless that and to go with it, rather than feeling that we are simply just carriers of God, somehow that God isn't somewhere else, he's only just with us. But
I really hear that. As an evangelist through and through, I really, really hear that. Theological question, if I may. I actually was in a prison 3 days ago. I did a placement visit for a student who's training to be ordained, and she's doing a placement in a prison in Cardiff. And I think there's about 750 inmates. It's a male prison. And I was there for a couple of hours, and we had a walk around, and we saw lots and lots of different aspects of the prison. But I also got to see the team of chaplains. Almost feels like they're living life with the inmates there, doing a kind of like sensitive, you know, carrying God, but also seeing God move with people in the prison as well. But we had a conversation about what it is to be a human and fully alive. As a result, and God's in, RNS, the glory of God as a living human being, fully alive. And it's kind of like, okay, so how do we, what do we think? This is, I'm sort of fumbling my way to the question. It's something along the lines of, maybe there's a need for some sort of, I've got such a pastoral heart, I don't even like using these words, punishment for that which is done wrong. I don't know. But when I see human beings locked up in that way, even very, very dangerous ones, I then, even though I think well, maybe we need to protect society and all the rest, and that's right and proper, maybe. But then I think about God's intention as I, in my limited understanding sense, I believe I've been taught about God's intention for humanity. I just kind of think, crumbs, where are we?
Yeah. And it's that tension, isn't it, between the kind of restorative, it's about restoration and rehabilitation. People need, obviously from society's point of view, it's vital that there's some sense in which they need to serve time because there are debts due to society. Yeah. But I think for me and living and working with and knowing something about prison chaplains, the work there of trying to provide an alternative narrative which is about the possibilities for rehabilitation and restoration. I mean, that's very, very tough work, but I think that for me that's for me where things are. And I think what I learned from that situation and other things is that of course we need to be really straight up about the way in which human sin and failure is manifest in our world. Stupid not to ignore that.
Absolutely.
But but actually the sense that for some people being sinned against, you are the victim of circumstances way beyond your control, is a really important theological insight to also offer, so that Christians work not only at the possibility that God can repair an individual, but actually God's repair and healing need to be seen in wider society to ensure that the situations which lead to people being in prison, severe poverty, oppression, injustices are broken, so that, as it were, it's both together. But tough call.
It is, and I feel like I always want to say something to all people involved in this sort of thing, that actually what God wants is for us as human beings to be fully alive. Yeah. And for a second, third and fourth and fifth chance and beyond for people to be offered. He wants us to be fully alive. He really, really does. So if you're in a position in life where actually you're thinking about doing something which perhaps might not be the best idea, just ponder on what we're chewing over here, that actually what God wants for you is to be fully alive. So ask him what that means and give him some time to actually sort of deploy that and show that in your life as well, because he's alive and he's all powerful and he will do it. Nicola.
Yeah.
Tell us how it came about. Did you spy her from across the room and say, "Ooh"?
Well,
who asked who out? Come on, give us the dirt.
To my horrendous shame, apparently what happened is that we came as single people to Trinity, didn't know each other before. We I think met at the first event was a kind of college social event, a barn dance or something like that, which began the college term. Apparently, I asked her to dance, but I can't remember.
You can't remember?
I can't remember.
Are you sure?
No, I honestly can't remember, Chris. So when we got together at the end of that first term, which was one of those moments where others said, yeah, come on. There was a growing friendship. But apparently Nicola is very dischuffed because she said, you've forgotten that, but I danced with you first. So that's where it began. But we then, we got to know each other over that first term, and then...
So all right, at the end of the term then, who asked who out? Who turned around to each other and said, come on, let's...
She invited me to supper, and I think, so actually, I suppose she did, didn't she? In the sense of, she asked me around.
What would we do about our wives?
Absolutely.
Bless. And would you say that God called you together?
Absolutely, entirely so. I mean, because it was really surprising. I think in that sense we'd come to Bristol for other reasons, a call from God to ministry, and neither of us expecting this, and suddenly an interweaving of lives, and really interesting that from quite a different background, from being born and brought up in Suffolk, not going to university, coming to work in London, a very different kind of background from mine. We kind of came together, and I mean, what Nicola has taught me again about life and about living in the heart and the guts, and with faithful experiences of God is never ending. And I mean,
Brilliant. Moving on, curacies.
Yeah.
Now, a curacy is kind of like a training type. It's like an apprenticeship, if I may use that language. And it's like you come out of theological college in the Church of England, having done all the essays and hopefully enjoyed all the theology and all that education. But then you're put into a context where you're actually doing, if you like, the practical side of things. And that's the next stage of your training. It's called a curacy. And it's normally about 2 or 3 years, sometimes 4, but generally 2 or 3 years. When I did my curacy, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really, really did. And thank you to Father Peter, my incumbent, for making it an incredible experience. But there were 1 or 2 curacies that kind of went a bit awry in the, we call it a diocese. It's kind of like an area of the Church of England. And mine was like all of South London, going right down to Gatwick, actually. And there were 1 or 2 curacies that kind of just didn't work. You know, the people just didn't get on and all that kind of stuff. And we kind of heard about these things in the ether, as it were. We all sat there, oh, please don't let it be us. Because it means moving house generally and moving, well, training job, as it were. But bless you, you say in your notes that you had two curacies, and the first one you say it went wrong.
It went wrong.
Are you okay to talk about it?
Yeah, fine, absolutely. And obviously, I need to be careful because there are other people involved in that. But yeah, I mean, Nicola and I were ordained together and appointed to neighbouring parishes to serve our curacy. So that's the way our faith and ministerial journeys were coming. So there was a sense in which the bishop of the area had to fuse some arrangement together. We lived in the house of the curate's house in the parish that I worked in, and Nicola travelled a few miles away. But basically, I mean, I'll be straight up with you. I was 26, and compared to the emotional intelligence which I believe my sons have, one is 26 and the other is 23, I was a long way short of that at that stage. So I went having been told that I was entering a situation where the incumbent and the parish were not at ease with one another. I entered that, I think, without my eyes being wide enough open, or without having really sufficient maturity, I think, to understand that. And others might say you're being hard on yourself. But basically, 20 months in, that collapsed. It was evident that the incumbent, the vicar and the parish were simply at so much logheads. I was piggy in the middle, stuck in the bit in the middle, and things unravelled slowly but surely, nothing very major, but it just became more and more uncomfortable. And the acting bishop in the area decided I needed a change. And I went to do a second curacy, which, to use the image of repair and healing, was everything that the first one wasn't. A really fine training incumbent, a lovely community that stretched my horizons, was big and adventurous in its scope and breadth. And I had a second chance. So if anybody's sitting there, I mean, the fact is, none of our time is wasted, is it? Nobody wishes difficult experiences on anybody, but frankly, life is full of them, and it's what you learn from them. And actually, in lovely providence and grace, I was given the chance to have a different experience, which was everything the first sadly wasn't.
So where was God in all that then?
Well, good question. And I think, frankly, if I believe God to be God, God could be present in mess and muddle, as well as in joy and fulfilment. Now, obviously, it might have been nicer and easier for me if I'd been placed somewhere else, but frankly, I think God was in all of that, teaching me something about being emotionally aware and mature in the first difficult experience, how life doesn't always work out. I'm quite an ordered person. I needed to be more responsive and reactive to mess and muddle, and it's life that's a bit chaotic brings you face to face with disappointment. If you've been used to life giving you things and things going quite well, when things don't, I think God was forming and shaping in the same way that all the good things in the second place, God was there as well.
Good news for anyone going through disappointment, be it in training or actually in a job, secular work and all that kind of stuff. God can use it no matter what. It really can. We've got living, breathing testimony of that. He's the head of formation in Church of England. I'm aware of time. These interviews, they go like that
Yeah,
when
they
you're
do,
actually
don't
in
they?
them. They really are. So I'm just conscious now, because I actually want to sort of zoom through. You, in 1996, just so that we got this recorded, you seemingly became a university chaplain.
That's right, in Leicester.
Brilliant. I can see that in you. I imagine you were brilliant at that. And in 2002, you went to St Albans Diocese, where you had a job share with your wife, 3 rural parishes, and lay educational work. I'd like to jump, though, if I may, because we're running out of time, to 2006, where you became the Director of Studies in ERMC.
That's right.
What's ERMC, and what was God doing at that time in your life?
Well, that's a fantastic story. ERMC is the Eastern Region Ministry course. And that's one of about 10 regional courses that are dotted around the country. They still exist, and they offer training for ordination and also for lay ministry for people who are in their workplace community and who don't have full time to devote to it, but are doing it by evening classes once a week and by coming to residential weekends. So, I mean, training briefly in the Church of England, there are 3 forms now. There are classic residential colleges, there are places like ERMC, and then there's places like St Mellitus who do full-time context-based learning. So ERMC is sort of in the middle of all that. But the wonder, I mean, the story of getting to ERMC is a rather wonderful thing. And again, if you ever get to the stage where you think that God doesn't bring all sorts of dreams of yours together,
tell us.
Here is a story about that.
I'm waiting.
I had, when we worked in the rural parishes in North Bedfordshire, I didn't find it terribly easy. Rural ministry is quite a lot of working with small groups of people. You're not necessarily resident in all the villages. It's quite hard but rewarding work. But I'd enjoyed that pastorally. I'd been able to work ecumenically across the Christian churches, partly there and partly in Leicester. And I'd also, the thing that I think I'm most proud of in everything that I've done ministerially, I set up a lay education centre in Bedford so that people of Bedfordshire could access discipleship training, faith development. And I had one of those conversations with my bishop, one of our, what you call ministerial development review at the end of the year. And he said, tell me a dream job, Ian. I said, well, it's pastoral oversight, it's adult education and working ecumenically. Literally 2 months later, an advert came out for that kind of job, working with the Eastern Region Ministry course, and the door opened. And a year after that, the principal of that course, that the vacancy became open for the principal, so the leader of that course, and I applied and I was appointed, which gave me even more capacity to shape those 3 things. So working at community, adult education, and the kind of oversight of a formational community. And I had 9 years in total of the most fulfilling and enriching work.
Hold phone. So there you are in rural ministry, kind of enjoying it, but there were pressures as well. And then you had this conversation with your bishop in your annual review, as it were, and you say, like, wave a magic wand, this is a job, and then 2 months later you're in it.
I know.
And then just 1 year later, you're the principal.
Yeah.
What does that do for your understanding of God?
It says, well, it's a story, isn't it? I mean, it's a rare story, I think. It doesn't happen to everyone, and it certainly doesn't happen all the time. And I might reflect that actually the ministry I'm exercising at the moment is much tougher in many ways. But it was one of those places where the dream of calling, the inner call, all the skills which God has formed in you, and the place all come together. So ERMC provided the context where, as it were, role and soul and context, which is a lovely phrase that I want to acknowledge I borrowed from a man called Michael Sean Patterson, who's a practical theologian. Role, soul and context, those things came together. When they do, that is the most amazing sense of God bringing those things together. Now, I think Yeah, so at ERMC, particularly when I was invited to take up a leadership role where I think you have a remarkable opportunity to shape the ecology of a place, how the surrounds in which people flourish, where I hope I might have given permission through the way that I offer hospitality, the way that I hope to offer pastoral care, the way that I'm committed to flourishing and graciousness and courtesy, old-fashioned gifts, but I think they make a community.
I agree.
And I was given the opportunity to practice those. I made mistakes as well, so don't get me wrong, but I think all those things came together. That's where life in its fullness comes to flourish. And I had a very lovely, flourishing time there, which I think has prepared me to do new ministry in places which might be more demanding or ask different things of you. But in that time, that was the place. But again, I just want to say, if you've got that coming together, role, soul and context, it's something about living here, something about living out, something about the people you're amongst. It's a joy and a gem. Grab it with every opportunity because it may not be forever, but I think seasonally, God gives us chances.
I think though what I'm hearing from your God story in a sort of overarching way though, Ian, is that there's evidence that God uses the tough times.
Yeah.
So he's nothing's ever wasted.
No.
But there's also much evidence that God is a generous God.
Yeah, thanks.
And I totally understand what you said about it doesn't happen to everyone, but rather wonderfully, a lot of the stories that I've actually recorded on God Stories today, there's evidence enough that it happens enough.
Yeah.
So be encouraged. So God's in everything, which is absolutely wonderful.
Absolutely.
Truly,
And
truly
generosity is such an important aspect of God. I mean, I think for me, discovering those things, that God is loving and generous. I mean, interestingly, what just reminds me, when I first told my story of coming to faith to somebody who's called a director of ordinance, who's the person who kind of nurtures your initial calling, I was really shocked when he said to me, "You haven't mentioned the love of God once." Perhaps that was still, Chris, something about stuff being in the head and not the heart. So I have grown to inhabit loving, generous, flourishing, overflowing, abundant God. Yes, of course, deeply testing when life doesn't show those things. But that's the God that I hope my life work point to.
It says here, 2015 ministry team.
Yep.
Second chair leadership, mediation, negotiation, renewal of qualities for discernment, more formational stuff, all for me about being caught up in the renewal. So I want to know about what you mean about all the other stuff, as I think we all do, but in particular, what you say here, caught up in the renewal of God's creation.
So that's if I have a kind of theological strapline about life, I think that we are called as human beings, we're invited by God into God's renewing of the whole of creation. Now, that's the big picture. So from the biblical stance, that comes from creation narratives right through to the Revelation narratives, but also goes through Romans 8, where the creation groans and longs for redemption. So that's for me, the big story about God is God's recreative and renewing work in the world. I express it like that because I just think that's a language that's very hopeful. But I also express it like that because I think the invitation into a future where God is all the theology I learnt in formal study, learning at the feet of a man called Jürgen Moltmann, who's a Christian writer, who writes all about the Spirit of God and the way in which God is continually present, but God is actually most present in the future, drawing the whole creation to God's self. Beautiful image. And I express that now in my own work because I'm deeply committed to the way in which a call to ministry and to the mission of God can only be held in the widest possible sense of God's work in the wider world.
Amen.
If ministry, ordained ministry, is the be all and end all, frankly, that's very dull and very difficult. because we're not called into the church for its own sake. This is about the renewal of creation, to use different language about the kingdom, about the Beatitudes, about all of that. So that's why that work is there, and frankly I've needed to cling on to that when the detailed work of looking after renewing processes of discernment, which we're asked to do here, of the looking after the work of theological education, of individuals' pathways through training, all of that it's good work, it's important work, but it could narrow your sight. So I hold that as the vision of what we're doing, not least because that's the vision we offer to the people of God as ordained persons. That's the renewal that they're all involved in, and frankly they're doing the frontline work of that. The role of ordained people, I think, is to enable that to happen and not to get in the way.
So do you resonate then with Tom Wright's work, encapsulated as well in Surprised by Hope, where he talks about actually what God's move is the renewal of all things, not the destruction of all things? Absolutely.
I mean, plainly, there are big Christian tradition tensions between those which emphasise our sin and frailty and the accountability or judgment that we'll need to face, and those traditions which talk about creation and recreation. And I'm completely honest, I get the first, but I live in the second. So for me, Irenaeus' whole view of kind of recapitulation, the way that Christ walks the way of loving obedience to God, and therefore recapitulates, walks the way that Adam and Eve couldn't walk. They failed to do that. Christ walks the same way and repairs the damage, heals the rifts, reconciles us to God, to our neighbour, to creation. That's the big story. So for me, I mean, reconciliation, which is part of that story, is all there.
So exciting.
So that's the big picture.
Last personal question before I get on to my very, very last question. Very briefly, biggest God moment that you can recall in your life?
Okay, I think. Let me tell you a story from. I think a story related to a formative time. I worked as a volunteer in inner city Manchester. Yeah. When in the year after university and in the time during which I went to have my call tested. When I was said farewell to at the end of my time there, at a church service, surrounded by people who took me as Ian from London. They didn't need to know my educational, family background. I was judged. I was worthy of being in their presence because I had come to live amongst them for a year. The things that they said about me at that time, I collapsed in tears. And their capacity to embrace a 3-year-old struggling to articulate the sense in which I'd been met by God in those people in a year where I had some rough encounters with young people with knives, handled badly on my part, but loved, welcomed and embraced by people who had nothing. First time ever I've seen an empty fridge because the person had run out of money. Just that sense of being met at that time, and a lovely woman said, we have never had in our midst anybody like you who's just come. That was the first volunteer from afar, as it were, just to be amongst. I think that's interesting, Chris, how that's come to me. It's not a big moment, but it's a moment of saying, partly at the end of a very formative year of voluntary work, where my call to ministry had been affirmed, actually the love and care of inner city women and men, unprepossessing, totally affirming, utterly undefended. Just stay with me.
Wow. That was
and a moment of deep vulnerability where I was overcome with uncontrollable tears, couldn't string together words of thanks, was blindsided in that phrase in terms of just being unprepared for my own reaction to what a year had done to me and what God had done.
Last question therefore, and it follows on very nicely from that. Imagine, I ask all my interviews this, imagine you're a gardener in the garden where Jesus, on the first Easter morning, met Mary, and there was that encounter, and he said to her, don't touch me, because I've not yet ascended to my Father. But you literally are a gardener, and you're in eyeshot and earshot. You know, they possibly don't know you're there, but you're in eyeshot and earshot. You've got your rake in your hand. You know, it's the Middle East, as it were. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's beautiful. I could work out in the Middle East. And you're raking the ground. You're doing your thing, and it's the first Easter morning, therefore, and you witness the first witness of that. What happened to humanity on that first Easter morning?
Humanity was shown what it could be, what women and men could be when they come face to face with the risen Christ, who was still human, bearing signs and marks of crucifixion, but was raised and met and encountered Mary, whose life was transformed. The irony, of course, he was the gardener, wasn't it? So that's humanity when God gardens in our lives. I love the gardening image. So if I was there as a gardener, I'd be saying, actually, this is the flourishing potential of what happens when somebody comes face to face with the risen Christ, has their fear turned to joy, their anxiety turned to hope, despair transformed into something of loving response. That's, yeah.
That was a brilliant answer, and I can see why you're the head of formation. I really can. This is amazing. This has been a wonderful interview. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
We're now going to go on to the section called Spotlight, okay, which is a bit of fun, as I mentioned before, but it's also something which, if you're a psychologist, as I often say, they love it. Not that I am, and thus I can't interpret it, but it's just a bit of fun.
Yeah,
really,
no worries.
And then if you could pray us out at the end, that'd be brilliant. But I just want to thank you again.
Thanks,
this has been brilliant.
Great.
Thank you for your time. The thing you can't live without.
At the moment, my phone.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's so honest. I love that. That's honest. It's brilliant. I love that. Okay.
I should say my wife.
I was literally going to say his wife. Everyone says me wife or me husband. I should say, how many times you look at your phone every day? But I won't. Now, this is a tough one for you, maybe, because I think this job is probably like the job. But what's the job you'd most like to have if you could wave a magic wand?
This is a great job, but actually, in honesty, I miss the kind of community-based work that I did previously with the RMC. So my dream job, ministerially, next one maybe, would be to have some kind of community engagement. So some return to oversight of a community which I could help to flourish.
Happy days. Film star crush?
Films.
Nicola's watching.
Oh wow! Well, actually, we went to see Emma, the Jane Austen Emma, and whoever is, I can't even remember her name. She's beautiful, but you do spend 2 hours watching her face in very close up. I don't have a crush on her, but she was very beautiful.
Very diplomatically done. Secret pleasure?
Except in Lent, eating chocolate, minstrels.
Minstrels?
Yeah.
Cool. If you could have a superpower, what would it be?
Eradication of malaria.
Nice. Favourite cereal?
Actually, boiling cornflakes.
Cool. When were you happiest?
When was I happiest? I'm happy now, Chris.
Good man.
I am. Yeah, it's silly to look back or look on. I'm just happy.
Good answer. Dark chocolate or milk chocolate?
Milk.
Ketchup or brown sauce?
Ketchup.
Can you reverse park?
I used to be able to. I now do it less well.
Okay.
I think I've cricked my neck.
Have you ever seen an angel?
No, but I think my wife Nicola has, or has been in hospital with people who have. I haven't.
Really?
But she's been with hospital patients who've seen angels at the end of the bed.
Really?
Wow.
Maybe there's an interview there.
Yeah, I think so. Much more interesting person.
Oh, come on. Favourite virtue?
Graciousness.
Wonderful. Coming into land. You're in heaven for the first time. and you meet Jesus face to face for the first time, what's the first thing that you'd like to ask him?
I have never asked myself that question. What a brilliant question. It would be boring to ask him about suffering, but I think, were you with me when time was really hard?
Okay, good question. You're in heaven for the first time, and you meet Jesus for the first time. What's the first thing that you'd like him to say to you?
I love you, welcome home.
2 more. You're in heaven for the first time.
These get more difficult, don't they?
Who's the first family member you'd like to meet?
My maternal granny.
Cool.
Yeah.
You're in heaven for the first time. You can throw a dinner party. There's about 5 guests and you, so 6 people around a table. Imagine it, however you imagine heaven to be, but there's a round table there, wonderful catering, Archangel Gabriel bringing in the wine, all the foods, lovely, lovely, lovely. You can invite anyone from history. Anyone from history. Biblical characters, people from history, who would it be?
The Mary who anointed the feet of Jesus with oil.
Okay.
I think Martin Luther King. Let's throw in Glenn Hoddle, boyhood Tottenham fan, sporting hero.
Punk rock people.
Punk rock. Ian Dury, that might be quite fun. Oh, Winston Churchill.
Oh, wow. Ian, this has been absolutely magnificent. It really, really has. Bless you for this time. Would you pray us out?
Of course. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for all that you call us to be, for the sense of humanity made alive in your grace and by your Spirit. Thank you for the work of your Son who forms in us your perfect image, who transforms us to be more like you. For those who are watching, we pray that your gracious presence may be made known in their lives, that something of your love, mercy, hope for the world might be communicated by the faith and life and actions of people who call themselves followers of Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.